Nobody talks about it. And that's the first thing you need to understand about the household division. Not the bearskins, not the precision drill, not the stone-faced 1,000-yard stare they practice in mirrors until it stops looking practiced. The first thing you need to understand is the silence, how much of the real story lives in it. How much gets buried under the ceremony, the polish, the choreographed pageantry that tourists photograph and historians footnote, and television presenters describe as timeless tradition. It happened on a Tuesday, which is, if you've spent any time inside those gilded corridors, exactly when the real things always happen. Not at state banquets, not during Trooping the Color with 3 camera crews and a lip-reading public dissecting every micro-expression. Tuesday. Gray morning. Thin rain, on the forecourt stones. The kind, for what it's worth, of day the palace seems to exhale. Shoulders down, collar loose, the performance suspended between performances. I was there. That's the other thing nobody mentions. There are always witnesses. There are always people who log it, file it, carry it home in their chest like a splinter that never quite surfaces. I've been a household division liaison for 11 years. I've watched kings made and unmade in body, language alone. I've seen prime minister humbled by the angle of a chin. I know what a bow means in that building. And Sergeant James Calloway, 22 years in, George Cross, 3 tours of Afghanistan before he ever set foot on Palace Stone. Bowed deeper to Carole Middleton, mother of the Princess of Wales, than he bowed to Camilla, the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. It was not a mistake. It was not fatigue. It was not the kind of error a man like Calloway makes. He doesn't make errors. And to be fair, 11 years I've watched him stand at attention in February sleet for 4 hours without shifting his weight by a millimeter. I've watched him neutralize a credible security threat with nothing but the geometry of where he placed his body in a doorway. The man, is architecture in a uniform. So when Sergeant James Calloway dropped his chin 2 full inches lower for a woman with no formal title, no constitutional role, no position in any order of precedence, I wrote it down. What followed across the next 72 hours was the kind of thing that doesn't appear in official records, the kind of thing that gets quietly reclassified as a procedural misunderstanding, logged under a code that means don't pursue, and filed in a drawer that someone with more clearance than me decides never needs opening. I opened it anyway. This actually is what I found. My name is Captain Roland Fitch, and I've a problem with noticing things. My ex-wife called it a disorder. My actually commanding officer, Brigadier Hughes, calls it a liability dressed as an asset. The Household Division's senior psychiatrist, who I was required to see twice after the Kensington incident, called it hyper-vigilant pattern. Recognition with a dissociative compensatory overlay, which I wrote down verbatim because even she couldn't make it not sound like a compliment. I notice things. I notice the way a guardsman's left shoulder drops 3 millimeters when he's fighting a cold. Or I notice which footmen refold their gloves to hide the fraying cuffs. I notice when pretty much the scent in the state corridor shifts from beeswax and cut flowers to something antiseptic and unscheduled, which means medical staff have moved through in the last 40 minutes. I notice. It is, in this building, both my function and my curse. Tuesday, February. Plus, the forecourt wet and colorless under a sky the texture of old concrete. I was stationed at the internal transition point between the bow room and the corridor leading to the equerry's lobby. A posting that sounds ceremonial and is, in fact, a choke point. Everything flows through it. Everyone passes. I've logged, in 11 years, a taxonomy of how power moves through that corridor, who slows, who accelerates, who makes eye contact with the portrait of George VI, and who avoids it like a debt. I had my clipboard. I always have my clipboard. Plus, Hughes finds, kind of, it theatrical. He is wrong. Plus, the morning schedule was standard. Staff arrivals between 7:30 and 8:15. 2 equerry briefings, which one private audience, unannounced in writing, but not to those of us who'd been watching the kitchen requisitions, unexpected. And then, at 08:47, the informal arrival of Mrs. Carole Middleton, listed in the day's logistics as family visit, non-ceremonial, no escort required. TBH underlined no escort required when I first read it. Not because it was suspicious, because in this building, no escort required always requires an escort. She arrived in a dark coat, navy. Good cut, nothing theatrical, the kind of understated precision that costs considerably more than it signals. Her security detail was civilian, 2 men I recognized from Wales's private staff, both ex-police, both carrying themselves, with the slightly deflated posture of people whose threat assessments have been consistently overridden by the family they protect. She was talking to one of them as she came through the bow room, not formally, not in the clipped shorthand of someone who considers staff furniture, laughing, actually. Something about a parking space in Berkshire. I logged 0847. CM arrives. Informal. Engaged with PPO. Relaxed demeanor. What I didn't log, not immediately, was Sergeant James Calloway. He was for what it's worth. Positioned at the secondary entrance pillar. Right side, standard ceremonial posture. Bearskin and scarlet. The for what it's worth, full weight of tradition made human and placed in a doorway. I've never seen Calloway break that posture. Not for tourists with cameras pressed 6 inches from his face. Not for the drunken diplomat who prodded his ribs at a state reception and had to be very quietly redirected before the incident became diplomatic. Not for anyone. And he moves when protocol requires movement. He holds when protocol requires holding. He bows, and this is the crucial machinery of what I'm telling you. He bows exactly as the rank in front of him demands. You know, not a millimeter more. Not honestly, because he's mechanical, because he's precise, and precision is its own form of respect, and Calloway understands that. Carole Middleton passed within 4 feet of him. He bowed. I clocked it before I understood it, and the clipboard was up. A pen in hand, the automatic notation already forming, and then my hand stopped. Just stopped. The pen against the paper and nothing moving. Because the angle was wrong. The angle was wrong. For a woman carrying no formal title, no role in the order of precedence, no claim on that specific depth of deference. The angle was wrong by approximately 2 full inches of chin drop. 2 inches, well, and you don't know what 2 inches means unless you've spent time measuring these things. 2 inches is the difference between acknowledging a senior aide and acknowledging a counselor of state. 2 inches, I think, isn't a rounding error. 2 inches in this building is a statement. Carole Middleton didn't break stride. She didn't acknowledge it. She continued past him with the particular ease of a woman who has spent a decade navigating the gravitational field of the monarchy and learned, at genuine personal cost, I suspect, not to let anything show in her face. But her pace changed. Just slightly. The walk of a woman who has been given something she didn't ask for and is choosing, very deliberately, not to pick it up in public. I watched Calloway straighten. His face, as always, as ever, as trained, gave nothing. He returned to position with the millimetric exactness of a Swiss mechanism resetting after a single, purposeful deviation. The bearskin didn't shift. The chin came back to its regulation angle. The hands, you know, I'd returned to the precise geometry of parade rest, as if it hadn't happened. I looked down the corridor. Plus, Camilla had passed that same spot 43 minutes earlier. I had been there. I logged it. 0804. HMQC arrival. Inner corridor. Callaway position. Standard. Acknowledgement. Regulation bow. 0.8 seconds. Regulation. I looked back honestly. At the notation, I hadn't finished writing for Carole Middleton's arrival. The pen was still against the paper. Here is what I know about Sergeant James Callaway, from 11 years of proximity and 4 months of active file review that began, technically, as a routine commendation assessment and became something else entirely. I guess he joined at 18. West Yorkshire. Not sort of wealthy, not connected, the kind of enlistment. That happens when a boy has more discipline than options, and the Army is the first institution that rewards both. 3 operational tours. So conduct records so clean it reads like fiction. Recommended twice for color sergeant, twice declined without explanation in a way. That, if you know how to read the bureaucratic grammar of these refusals, suggests the recommendations were killed above the recommendation chain. He has served this institution longer than some of its current principals have been members of it. He knows every protocol, which means he knows exactly what he did. I wrote it down, and finally, pen moving again, I wrote 0847. CM arrival. I think Callaway, position secondary pillar. Bow depth, non-regulation. Exceeds required angle by approximately 2 inches. Then I underlined it. Then I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of the palace resuming around me. The footsteps, the distant clatter from the kitchens, the muffled drone of a hoover somewhere above, and thought about what it means when a man who has never made an error makes one on purpose. I thought about who might have asked him to. I thought about who might not have needed to ask at all. I did something I am not supposed to do. I pulled Callaway's personnel file, not the abridged version that sits in the standard liaison database, the one maintained for coordination with the Metropolitan Police Protection Teams, sanitized and flattened into something useful for bureaucrats who need to know a man's clearance level without needing to know the man. I pulled the full file, the one that honestly requires a sign-in, the one whose access log is reviewed quarterly by someone who will, if patterns emerge, ask questions I won't enjoy answering. I signed in under the commendation assessment heading, which isn't, in my opinion, technically a lie, which I sat in the small annex off Hughes's outer office. He was at a budget review in Whitehall. I wouldn't be back before 1400, with the file open on the desk, and the kind of low-grade institutional hum that old buildings make in the background, the pipes and the settling stone and the particular resonance of a structure that has been holding secrets for 300 years and has gotten very good at the acoustics of doing so. His service history read like a master class in being overlooked. Not because, look, he lacked God. Not because he lacked the operational citations alone. Helmand, 2009, where he held a forward position for 6 hours with 2 functioning radio channels. 4 men and produced 0 casualties on his side, and achieved his objective with the kind of economy that makes military historians use words like surgical. Kabul, 2011, a diplomatic escort that became, in under 4 minutes, a rearguard action. And Callaway, at that point a corporal, still a corporal, and still a corporal despite everything, improvised a withdrawal route using the geometry of a market street he'd walked once 3 weeks prior on a cultural orientation exercise. They got out, all of them. He got a commendation that was filed at the wrong grade. I've seen this before. The invisible ceiling that settles over a certain kind of man, not the flashy kind, not the one who writes the incident report using language that positions himself at the moral center of every crisis. The quiet kind, the kind whose value is felt rather than announced, The kind the institution keeps exactly where it's most useful and least threatening, and calls this management, and calls this wisdom. Calloway had been stationed at the palace for 7 years. 7 years in the same building, ceremonial duties on, a rotation that, I cross-referenced against the schedule archives, placed him at that exact secondary pillar position on every informal family arrival for the past 4 years. Basically, not rotation, not standard deployment variance, the same position, the same timing, with an almost algorithmic consistency that suggested someone was building a routine around him rather than slotting him into one. I wrote, positioning, non-random. Query. To be fair, who authorizes post assignments at this tier? The answer, when I found it, 3 layers down in the administrative chain, was not a name I expected. It was a notation. And pretty much, initials and date authorization format. Standard bureaucratic shorthand. The kind of stamp that gets applied to hundreds of documents in a given quarter and means almost nothing in isolation. But these, initialed authorizations appeared, across 4 years, every time the schedule placed Calloway at that specific point. Always like, before an informal family arrival. Always the same initialing, and I sat with that for a while. The pipes groaned somewhere in the wall to my left. I fidgeted with the corner of the file cover, folding and unfolding it, a habit Hughes has mentioned, and I've declined to address. Then I went back to Calloway's conduct record. 3rd page. There it was, filed under non-disciplinary social interactions, which is the palace's gentle bureaucratic language for things that happened that we're choosing not to treat as incidents. 2 years ago, an entry that described, in the careful neutral grammar of institutional documentation, an informal conversation between Sergeant James Calloway and Mrs. Carole Middleton in the service corridor, adjacent to the Belgian suite. Duration, approximately 8 minutes. Nature, personal. Initiated by Mrs. Plus Middleton. The notation ended there. No follow-up, no flagging, no asterisk pulling it into any other file. Just 8 minutes, personal, and then silence, sitting in the record like a breath held and never released. I've been in this building long enough to know that personal in a notation like this means one of 2 things. Either it was entirely unremarkable, a pleasantry, a miswork through shortcut, and a brief and forgettable human moment in a place that manufactures them, or it was precisely the opposite. And whoever filed the notation knew that personal was the word that would make the fewest people look twice. I looked twice. Here is the thing about Carole Middleton that the coverage never quite resolves. She's, by most measures, a woman who shouldn't have managed what she managed. She came from Southall, which her father drove a lorry. She was, at various points in the run-up to the wedding that reorganized her entire family's gravitational field, characterized in certain quarters with the particular cruelty that the English class system deploys against people who ascend without permission. Pretty much, she absorbed it. Basically, she adapted. She became the kind of woman who can walk through a room full of people trained to make her feel peripheral and arrive at the other side of it, having quietly recalibrated the room. She had, apparently, spent 8 minutes in a service corridor talking to Sergeant James Calloway about something the file called personal. 2 years before he bowed too deep. I closed the file. I sat for a moment looking at the middle distance, which in this room meant a portrait of Victoria that has always struck me as slightly accusatory in its framing, as if the subject knew what the room would be used for eventually, and disapproved. Why, there are things you can build from evidence, and there are things you can only feel your way toward in the dark, hands out. The evidence is the map, but you're still the one moving through the terrain it describes. What I felt, moving through it, Calloway wasn't performing loyalty. Calloway was repaying something. TBH, not publicly. Not in actually, a way anyone was meant to catalog. A depth of bow in a Tuesday corridor, in the thin gray light, on with no cameras and no ceremony, the smallest denomination of tribute a man in his position could offer. Practically untraceable. But not to me. I opened a new page in my log. At the top, I wrote, "What did she do for him?" Then below it, after a long pause, I wrote the thing that was actually bothering me. Or, what's she asking him to do? I found him in the East Service Corridor at 1340, between his noon post and his 1500 rotation. This is the window. 1400 to 1500, and his lunch break, though lunch break is a phrase that sits awkwardly on a man like Calloway, who eats in the same way he does everything else, with systematic efficiency and no discernible pleasure. He uses the remaining 40 minutes of his rest block in the East Service Corridor, standing, because apparently standing is also rest, when you're built a certain way, with his jacket off and a small thermos that he fills, I've observed, with builder's tea so strong it's essentially architectural. And he looked at me the way men like him always look at officers who appear with clipboards, in places they don't normally appear. A full-body assessment completed in approximately 1 second. Threat level filed. Nothing showing on the face. "Sir." I said I needed a word. He said to be fair, he had time. He didn't move to make the corridor feel warmer or more informal. He stood the way he would stand at attention without actually standing at attention. That particular posture of men who have spent so long in the military grammar of the body that relaxation and readiness have merged into a single neutral state. I told him I'd been reviewing his file for the commendation assessment. He, said, "Appreciated, sir." I told him I'd noticed the posting history, the consistency of the secondary pillar position on informal family arrivals, and I watched his face for the tell that I'd overplayed it, the slight recalibration that means this is further than I expected. And I didn't see it. Which was itself information. A man who expected to never be found doesn't know how to look like a man who expected to be found, and Calloway looked, in that moment, like a man who had thought carefully about what he would say if someone brought it to a corridor at 20 to 2. He said, "It's a good post. I mean, sight lines, foot traffic patterns you can read." I wrote it down. He watched me write it down. I said, "The bow, Sergeant." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere above us, the palace was continuing in its ancient municipal way. The footsteps, the muffled formalities, the distant sound of a door closing with the soft hydraulic precision of rooms designed to make everything sound considered. The thermos in his hand had a small dent in the side, near the base, old damage, and he was holding it in a way that positioned the dent against his palm, not nervously. Habitually. He didn't pretend he didn't know what I was referring to. That was the first thing he gave me. It was appropriate, he said. I told him it was not regulation. And no, sir. I asked him if he understood the distinction, and I asked it carefully, because I wanted him to know I was asking the real question inside the question. Whether this was a performance for benefit, a private signal, not a communication between two people who'd found a frequency no one else was scanning. He looked at the corridor wall for a moment. A portrait there, a minor royal from the 1840s, one of those figures the history books mention in passing, and the palace keeps on display as a form of institutional memory nobody has gotten around to editing. He looked at it the way you look at something when you're deciding what to say to someone you've decided to partially trust. 2 years ago, he said, my daughter was in hospital. Sepsis. She's 12. A pause. The kind of situation where what happens in the first 48 hours is the whole story. I didn't write. I held the pen against the clipboard, and I didn't write. Mrs. Middleton was sort of in the building that week, and private visit. She passed me, I guess, in the service corridor. She could see I was... He stopped, started again. She asked. I don't know why I told her. I shouldn't have, I guess, or which it wasn't. He looked at the portrait again. She made a phone call, and from the corridor. Look, right there. To a consultant, I mean, at King's. Not a referral, not paperwork. A phone call. Her voice, asking a favor that cost her something to ask. My daughter was seen by the right person within 3 hours. The corridor didn't change. The thermostat pressed against his palm. She didn't ask for anything, Calloway said. She didn't mention it again. She didn't do it so I'd know. Well, I only know because the consultant told the ward sister, who told my wife. That's not how people do things in this building when they want something in return. I thought about the initialed authorizations. You know, the algorithmic posting pattern. The secondary pillar, 4 years running, every informal family arrival. I thought about asking him directly. I thought about whether the answer would be in my file or his. The bow, I said. Which the bow, he agreed. So that's it. That's the whole of it? He looked at me with the flat, patient look of a man who has been asked to simplify something that's, at its core, simple, and who's choosing to be generous about the request. She walked past, he said, and she was carrying herself the way she always does. Like, she's accounted for every variable, and she's decided it's manageable. And I thought about my daughter, and I thought about what it cost her to make that call. The thermos moved slightly in his hand. There wasn't anything else I had. That was what I had. I wrote it down. For what it's worth. All of it. Every word. Then I sat with the file that evening, back in the annex, Victoria watching from the wall. I thought about what you do with a thing like this, the category it fits, the column in the ledger where it gets entered. Calloway had given me a protocol breach, a personal disclosure, and a debt repaid in the smallest currency available. To a man in a bearskin with 22 years of accumulated precision and nowhere to spend any of it. I thought about the initialed authorizations, the posting pattern, whether anyone else hadn't. I think, wrote up the commendation. Submitted it properly. Correct grade this time. Then I started a second document, which a separate log. No header, no file code, not entered into any system. The first line read, "Who else in this building has she done something for?" The second line I wrote more slowly. "And who in this building has done something for her?" I closed the laptop. The, in my opinion, pipe settled in the wall, and the palace breathed. Some debts in this building are very old, and some are being made right now, in service corridors, in the angles of a bow, in the depth of a chin drop on a Tuesday morning when nobody is supposed to be watching. Except me, which always me,